rules like that? This is unacceptable behavior!
To explain, it's not what you think!
The officer's boots were planted in my driveway like he owned the ground, and his words hit harder than any punch. Sir, you're under arrest for trespassing on HOA property. Behind him, Delilah Thornfield stood with her arms crossed, chin lifted, as if she'd just caught a criminal instead of a neighbor taking out the trash. The Tennessee sun made the asphalt shimmer, and for a moment I wondered if the heat had warped reality. Delilah was smiling like she'd won something, like she'd finally proven she was the ruler of this cul-de-sac. She pointed at my roof, at the solar panels I had installed to save money and live a little cleaner, and she spoke like a preacher. The officer looked uncomfortable, but he was doing what she wanted. I reached into my pocket and felt the corner of a document, the one thing that could blow the whole thing open. I wasn't even part of the HOA, but she had already decided I belonged to her rules. That's when I realized this wasn't about solar panels or property values. This was about power, and power once tasted never stops asking for more. My name is Adrian Whitmore. I'm 52, retired electrician, with a back that aches like an old warning bell every time I bend. I drive a 10-year-old pickup that still smells faintly of burnt coffee, and I own nothing in my closet that costs more than $20. But the land I live on is not just land. It's a legacy. It's been in my family since 1978, when my grandfather bought a patch of old cornfields and coyote trails long before the city ever reached our horizon. He was old school, the kind of man who believed in keeping what's yours and staying out of other people's business. He built the farmhouse himself, and even now, the porch still holds the memory of his voice. Keep what's yours, he used to say, pipe smoke curling around his words. Never give away everything, always keep something they need. In 2001, a developer came sniffing around, waving money my grandfather needed for medical bills. He sold most of the land, but he kept the house and a few key parcels scattered through what would become Willowbrook Estates. When he passed in 2003, he left everything to me, along with a warning about city people. They'll take everything if you let them, but they'll respect you if you don't. For 15 years, I lived quietly. I helped neighbors fix breakers, fetched lost dogs, and never caused trouble. Then Delilah Thornfield arrived in 2018, driving a BMW like it came with a title. She talked like she owned the neighborhood, judging everything from mailbox colors to grass height. Within 6 months, she was on the HOA board. By the end of the year, she was running the place. At first, it was small things. She snapped photos of my old workshop and called it rustic, like it was an insult. She turned my vegetable garden into a crime scene. My table saw became a noise violation. I tried to explain that my house wasn't part of their HOA. She didn't care. She kept telling neighbors I was dragging down property values. People who used to wave began looking away. I began to notice her pattern. She didn't enforce rules, she weaponized them. She bullied the Johnsons into tearing down a basketball hoop. She convinced the city to force the Ramirez family to remove a legal fence. She didn't care about community, she cared about control. Then I installed solar panels. That was the day she snapped. She came over with the covenant book like it was scripture. Every modification requires board review, she said. I told her it wasn't my HOA. Her face turned red, and she snapped back. Everybody in Willowbrook Estates follows our rules, no exceptions. That was her first mistake. She filed a complaint with the county, claiming I had a non-compliant structure. She wanted me punished, and she thought she had the power to make it happen. That's when I realized I needed to fight back, not with anger, but with proof. I went to the courthouse under fluorescent lights that flickered like hope in a storm. Bernice, the clerk who had worked there longer than most presidents served, typed in my address and leaned back. "Honey," she said, "you've got some interesting history here." She printed the records, and what I saw made my electrician instincts scream about fine print. When my grandfather sold the land, he kept 9 parcels, the community center, the playground, the pond, even the mailbox cluster. All the parts that made Willowbrook tick were on my land. Every day, neighbors crossed it without a clue. I wasn't even back in my truck before Delilah called. She announced she had organized a petition claiming 3 households wanted me to join the HOA. I listened, already picturing her face when she realized what I had found. I asked her if she ever wondered who owned the ground she walked on to get her mail. She snapped, That's community area. She hung up furious. 3 days later, her petition arrived at the clerk's desk with 23 signatures, not worth the paper they were printed on. I called Pete, an old surveyor with more orange flags than a utility company. He walked the property for hours while Delilah watched from her window like a hawk. When he finished, he looked at me and grinned. "Your grandpa was smart," he said. "He kept the parts that make a place work." That night, I stared at the flags and planned what came next. The following week, Delilah strutted up my driveway and began ticketing my nephew Jake for visitor parking violations in my own driveway. Jake stared at her like she was a ghost. Delilah cited Section 4.7. She said my driveway was now community property, and she acted like she was delivering justice. I filmed the whole thing. After she left, I set up security cameras. The footage captured her husband driving a trailer across my grass, dumping yard waste, and the worst of it, Delilah sneaking out at night to spray paint my orange survey flags green. The next morning, I met her at the mailbox. I didn't yell, I didn't threaten, I just showed her the footage and asked if she knew what tampering with survey markers was called. Her face went pale, and she clutched her mail like it could save her. She had crossed a line into criminal behavior. She didn't stop. She filed another complaint with the county, claiming I was running an unlicensed electrical business from home. The inspector came, listened to my explanation that I only helped neighbors, and said there was no charge. Then he said, "We still have to investigate." That phrase sounded like punishment without a trial. I knew I needed more than patience. I filed a FOIA request. When the records arrived, they were thick and messy, filled with invoices, meeting minutes, and maintenance orders. The truth was brutal. The HOA had spent nearly $1 million on improvements on my land, not one of them authorized. They had assumed my land belonged to them, and they had spent like it was theirs. When the inspector returned, I handed him my deeds and the HOA records. He flipped through the pages, his expression changing from routine to shock. He stared at the documents as if they had a pulse, then said, "You need an attorney." His words felt like a key turning in a lock. The system was finally waking up. The biggest blow came from Grandpa's old files. I spent nights in the farmhouse, sorting through yellowed papers while the house creaked like it was whispering secrets. Then I found the easement. The HOA's right to use those parcels was temporary, set to expire in a year, not permanent, not infinite, a deadline. I also found 14 maintenance violations, each carrying a penalty of $50,000. The math was staggering, $700,000 in penalties tied to my land. I began sharing what I found with neighbors. At first, they listened with disbelief. Then letters arrived on my porch, recordings, stories, notes about how Delilah had targeted others. People who once avoided eye contact now stood beside me. I decided to make the truth public. I invited everyone to a barbecue at my property, asking them to bring questions, documents, and courage. I invited the county commissioner, the township supervisor, and a local reporter. The day of the event, the yard buzzed with families, the smell of grilled meat in the air, and children playing without fear for the first time in weeks. Delilah showed up holding a folder of police reports, ready to shut it down. She expected confrontation and me to back down. But I laid the deeds and records on a table in the open, letting the sun shine on them like a spotlight. I spoke with clarity, not anger. I explained the easement, the violations, and the penalties. I told them the HOA had 30 days to fix the violations or pay the penalties, and 60 days to negotiate a lease or remove its structures from my land. The words hung in the air like a verdict. People stared, stunned. Delilah's eyes narrowed, but she could not argue with paper. By Monday, she resigned. The board elected Janet Morrison, a retired teacher with a sharp mind and a fair heart. She called me soon after, asking to negotiate a fair lease. I agreed. We signed a 10-year lease, with the HOA responsible for maintenance and a promise to respect property lines. I waived the penalties, not out of weakness, but because I wanted the community to heal. We also agreed on a new Bill of Rights for residents, protecting them from harassment and abuse of power. The neighborhood began to breathe again. The Johnson kids got their basketball hoop back, Mrs. Vanessa replanted her garden, and kids laughed like they used to. The lease income allowed me to start the Willowbrook Trade Scholarship, giving $5,000 a year to local kids pursuing trades. Jake's girlfriend became the first recipient, heading to electrician school with a scholarship that felt like a new beginning. 6 months later, we hosted Good Neighbor Day, a celebration of music, chili, basketball, and laughter that echoed down the streets. Delilah had moved on, joining another HOA board somewhere else. Some people never change, but for the rest of us, everything did. The pond sparkled, the playground was safe, and the community center became a place for listening, not lecturing. My solar panels still shone, saving money and making no one angry. And sitting on the porch with a cold beer, I finally understood Grandpa's lesson. Always keep something they need. It wasn't just land. Sometimes it's courage. Real authority doesn't come from a rulebook. It comes from standing up for what's right, even when the odds are stacked against you. The next morning, the neighborhood woke to a new kind of tension. Delilah walked to the mailbox with her usual air of ownership, but her posture was different, as if the night had bruised her confidence. I met her there, holding my phone with the security footage ready to play. I knew this was the moment the neighborhood could choose courage. That footage was more than proof. It was a window into how she treated rules like a sword. Neighbors had been living under her shadow, believing her warnings were law instead of personal vendettas. I realized her power came from fear, and fear only works when people stay silent. So I started speaking to people one by one, not as a crusader, but as a neighbor asking for truth. Each story I heard was a small cut, and together they formed a wound she could no longer hide. When the FOIA records arrived, I felt like I was holding a ledger of stolen authority. The numbers were cold, but the impact was human. Families pushed, dreams delayed, lives made smaller. I knew that if I went public, she would attack harder, but I also knew silence would only make her stronger. On the day of the barbecue, I watched the crowd arrive and felt the weight of responsibility settle on my shoulders. The story didn't end with Delilah's resignation. It ended with a community that finally learned what real justice looks like. The neighborhood healed, not because one man won, but because everyone decided they would not be ruled by fear anymore. And in the quiet after the storm, I understood something Grandpa always knew. Power isn't earned by titles or rules. It's earned by standing up, even when you're the only one standing.